Hello and welcome to a segment of Sage Advice for Dragon Talk Live. I think this is the first time we're doing this live with you, Jeremy.
Yes, it is.
This is Jeremy Crawford, managing editor for Dungeons & Dragons, as well as chief rules developer.
Yes, that's correct.
Nice. Nailed it.
You got it.
All right.
My multi-part title.
I like the chief. Is the chief right?
Lead rules developer.
Lead. See, that was the one I was not sure of.
Yeah.
But I like chief.
Chief also works.
Because it's, it feels like it's got more portent behind it.
I also go by Archwizard of Rules, if you prefer.
Oh, I like that one. Can we do Archwizard of Rules? That's way easier to rolls off the tongue a little bit more.
Or as I'm known online, just simply the Sage.
The Sage.
Yes.
I like that too.
Yeah.
So this is the segment of the podcast where we go into specific rules questions that Jeremy sometimes gets on Twitters, as well as questions about things about 5th edition in general. And that's one of the topics for today. Rather than doing a specific rule, we're talking about more about like the philosophy behind rules, adjudication, as well as the general versus the specific and things like that. So yes, Jeremy, start us off. Where do you think we should begin here?
So occasionally we revisit this topic, whether it's been in the Sage Advice column. I think even in some of our Dragon Talk podcasts, we've sometimes talked about the philosophy of rules in 5th edition.
Yeah.
I like for us to come back to the topic every so often, about every 9 months or so, because I think it's great for the community to remember, why do we even care about rules?
Right.
What's behind the design of the rules in 5th edition? What's behind the rulings I make for 5th edition? Because if anyone who's joining us doesn't know my role, in addition to being the managing editor and the lead rules developer, I was also the lead designer of the player's handbook. And I'm also the one person on staff who can make official rulings for Dungeons & Dragons.
I've tried on Twitter to do, and I'm always like, I always give it up to you because I'm always like, I think I've heard Jeremy say this, but he's the ultimate arbiter of this.
Right. And because of that situation, it's good for us every now and again to catch our breath and talk about, what does it even mean when I make an official ruling? Right. And how do all these things go together to create the D&D experience that so many of us love?
Yeah, and we talk about storytelling so much with Dungeons & Dragons because it is basically a framework to tell stories with your friends and getting into that. And I've said that a few times and in conversation, and people have said like, well, then why we spend so much time on the rules then if it's just a storytelling game? But I think that speaks specifically to what you're talking about here. Is like that framework is what is very important.
And you get right there to the heart of it. The rules are there to serve the storytelling of each D&D group. The storytelling that is sort of conducted by the dungeon master. I'm thinking of the DM almost like a conductor of a symphony. And the players are each playing their instrument. And together, they sometimes create beautiful music. Sometimes it's a funny cacophony. But at its best, it's usually fun, funny, sometimes moving. The rules are there to provide a framework for the action, to provide a way to resolve the simple question of, do I succeed at this or not?
Right.
The rules at their heart are there to answer that question. The rules are also important because it helps create a common experience. If every group was just gathering and doing improvisational storytelling, that's just storytelling. What turns it into Dungeons & Dragons is the common high fantasy genre that runs through all D&D storytelling. But then it's also this common framework, these rules, because of the rules, when you say, hey, I played D&D last Thursday, and if I say, yeah, I ran my home D&D game a couple of weekends ago at my house, because of the rules and the common understanding of what those rules do, people know what you mean. Like, oh, I know what a D&D experience is like in general. The particulars are different in every game session. Right. Even if two groups are playing the exact same published adventure, their experience of that adventure is going to be different.
Right.
Yet there's a common understanding of sort of what the machinery of that experience was like. Like when a fight broke out, everyone who plays D&D knows, okay, initiative was rolled and people rolled to hit and damage was rolled. It creates this lingo that we all share and kind of a touchstone for, these elements pop up in every D&D story.
Yeah.
So the rules help create a through line.
I like your analogy to musical performance, because it does, the more everything you're just talking about, I'm like, oh right, well that's like the idea of musical notation, or even as you said, the conducting. Like there's certain conventions and tropes means that someone who plays in an orchestra, and shout out to Lauren Oboe Crazy, who plays in an orchestra, who's actually I think in the chat right now, who made me think about it. But like that you can go to play with a group that's in Russia and play with a group instruments here in America, and it doesn't matter because the common language of what the musical notation means everybody can kind of speak to the same. The music is all going to be the same, and that's very similar with Dungeons and Dragons.
Absolutely. And the rules also do one other thing for us, and that is combine storytelling with gameplay. Because there are a lot of people who come to D&D excited by the stories, but they also want to really dig into customizing a character, figuring out, how powerful can they make this person? Or in the case of a dungeon master, it might be someone who really loves creating the game mechanics of a new monster or designing a new magic item. So the rules also give us a toolkit for kit bashing, for making new things, but all again within a common framework, so that even if a DM creates a brand new monster that no one has ever seen before, because of the rules, there's a framework for how people will interact with that monster that is familiar and helps, again, create that common D&D experience. So all of that said, the rules, and I've said this many times before, the rules are secondary to the story. I always like to equate the rules to a butler. And the rules are there to serve up a nice experience, but the rules are not the master of the house. The master is the common story that's being told, and the person who oversees the telling of that story is the dungeon master. And so first and foremost, the rules are a butler in service to the dungeon master. And that isn't just sort of a nice guideline. That is itself a rule of the game.
Right.
One of the most important rules of the game is that the DM's say overrides everything else.
Right.
So
not just at the table, but through character creation and all that.
Absolutely. So that's even true of my rulings. I often like to remind people that even though I'm the only person who can give an official ruling for sort of the game itself.
Right, what you were intending when you were writing it down.
Yeah, exactly. No matter what I say, the dungeon master at every table holds sway. And so the DM can ignore whatever I say. And we want that. If let's say a rule that we wrote or a ruling that I provide is exactly the help that a dungeon master needs, it's exactly the thing that helps something run smoother or brings more smiles to the players' faces or makes them laugh or what have you, awesome. Then I want the DM to take that rule or take that ruling and run with it. But if I ever say something where the DM is like, that doesn't feel right for our table, or we've been doing it a different way all this time, or we have a house rule that we like better than the official rule, I want that DM to ignore whatever I said and do what feels best for that particular table. Because one of the beauties of D&D is that each of us as a dungeon master can customize the game experience on the spot to bring more smiles to people's faces. I mean, I often, when I'm DMing, and this actually goes back to when I was in theater. I did a lot of acting through high school and college. And often when you're on stage, whether you're an actor or a stand-up comedian or what have you, you're often trying to get a read from the audience.
Right.
And to me,
sometimes to your detriment.
Yes. Yeah. You can fall down that rabbit hole and
pretty quick.
And it can take you to places where suddenly kind of blow up your performance.
Yeah. But you get a skilled performer can read, oh, this is working, and continue giving the audience what they want in that vein.
Exactly. While keeping in mind the story you want to tell. You don't want to lose the thread of your own story or of the game experience you're creating.
Yeah.
But it's great that a DM can kind of tweak on the spot, can pivot, can adjust how something works.
So do you, when just going back to what the DM says at the table goes, like do Do you ever get spontaneous rules questions coming to you at conventions or things like that? Where like, oh, you said this and you said this, and what's the right thing to do? And how do you respond to that?
The right thing to do is always what the DM says. I can, again, provide sort of the official ruling on what we meant by a particular rule. I can help explain the rules that are there. I can point to where the rules are, because sometimes, given how many pages are in our book, sometimes people they don't know where the rule is. Right. And so sometimes we just need to say, hey, here's where you can find the rule that answers the need that you're expressing for your game. But beyond essentially being there to provide clarification, to talk about our intent, to point the way to where people can find the rules themselves, again, at the end of the day, it's really up to the DM. And that's really important to us because that helps preserve the dynamism of D&D. It means that a DM should never feel bound by what I said somewhere in an FAQ. The DM should feel free in the moment, following his or her gut, right, knowing better than anybody else what that particular group of players is going to enjoy, gives them the freedom to make rulings and to conduct their game in a way that's going to bring the most fun to their group. Because that, at the end of the day, is what it's about. It's not about pleasing kind of an abstract D&D audience, sort of imaginary people. We don't create D&D for sort of a realm of platonic ideals.
Yeah.
This is D&D for the angels. It's D&D for real people.
No D&D game survives contact with the enemy. Is that what you're, that
right.
kind of idea?
Yeah.
Has that always? I mean, this philosophy, has this always been true of Dungeons and Dragons, or is this kind of fine-tuned for how you approached 5th edition?
So. This was really the philosophy in the game's earlier days, and it's always been a part of the game's mix. But that said, as the game has evolved through its various editions, at various times there's been a greater or lesser emphasis on sort of what the official rules are. The previous 2 editions before 5th definitely had a bit more of an emphasis on what are the official rules given by Wizards of the Coast. And almost in a way to kind of like DM-proof the game.
To kind of standardize it in a way, right? To like for Adventurers League play, or before that, the RPGA play. So that
whereas we in 5th, and this goes all the way back to the earliest days of the D&D Next playtest, we really embraced as our philosophy, this is a game run by DMs for other human beings, and each of these DMs needs to feel like they have the liberty to run the game in the way that is going to please each particular group of players as much as possible.
Right.
And I always emphasize each group of players, because even I as a DM morph a little bit whenever I am DMing for a different group.
Right.
For example, when I DM my home game, my home game includes players like Chris Perkins and James Wyatt, both on staff here. Both have done, of course, tons of work on the game. My home game is just drenched with story, and we can easily have, out of a 4-hour session, 2 or 3 hours where I'll look back at it and it's like, wow, they just walked around and talked to everybody in town. and they went shopping, and not only did they shop, they talked to every shopkeeper. What is your story? How are you connected to what's going on in this city? They just love to dig deep into my setting. Whereas, particularly sometimes when I'll DM at a convention, I'll get a read on the table and it's like, these people want some action.
Right.
And
they want to get in the thick of it.
Yeah, and so there, suddenly my emphasis is going to be much more on let's get that initiative rolled as soon as possible, and they're going to throw down.
I love that this current edition embraces all those play styles too.
Yes.
And it's like whatever is right for that specific group, and it's a good way of putting it, is like that group of people, because there will be certain players who, might sway one way even at the same table. But you always want to balance that as the dungeon master, and the framework that's in 5th edition is prime for that.
Now, that all said, we do still want there to be a common experience. We do still want there to be a foundation of rules that every group can rely on, so that when we say we're playing 5th edition D&D,
it means something.
It means something.
Right.
And so that's why we ensured through the playtest process, and thanks to the feedback of tens of thousands of playtesters, we made sure that the core of the game was solid and also simple, because we wanted to make it so that it was not a labor for DMs to remember the basics of the game. We wanted all those really fundamental rules to be pretty lean, to be solid, to be easy to remember, and then to make sure that when the rules started to get a little detailed and finicky, it was sort of pushed away from the core and more kind of onto the fringes, more in kind of the exceptional parts of the game, with the understanding that some groups will forget those rules that don't come up as often, and the game's going to be okay. That's the other thing that's a part of our philosophy of this is a game run by DMs for particular groups, is it's okay if a rule got forgotten, because often it's just going to come out in the wash. Because this is a co-op game, that's the other important thing about the philosophy of D&D rules. This is a co-op game.
Everybody at the table is trying to work together, including the dungeon master.
Exactly. The DM can often, let's say the DM forgot a rule or ruled in a particular way that harms the players in an unintended fashion.
Yeah.
Rather their characters. I certainly hope the DMs aren't harming the players. If your DM players is harming you, call 911.
It's a cry for help.
Yeah. The DM, if the DM discovers he or she has done something they didn't intend, and the characters have suffered some unintended adverse effect, because it's a co-op game and because the DM is in control, the DM can often course correct. Mm-hmm. If not in that very moment, often later in that play session or in a subsequent session.
Right.
So even when, again, rules are forgotten or they're misunderstood or misapplied, it's rarely going to harm the game, because we also have built the system to be flexible and resilient.
Right.
We point out in the Dungeon Master's Guide in particular that you can actually kind of get a little loosey-goosey with a number of rules as long as you're pretty strict as a DM about just the few rules we have in place that are really there to control certain effects from getting completely out of hand. Like we tell the DM in the Dungeon Master's Guide, make sure you follow the rule on concentration for concentration spells, unless you want a bunch of stacking magical effects, which not only would make certain monsters and spellcaster player characters too powerful, but actually more importantly to us, would just bog the game down. It would make it go really slowly. One of the reasons why...
Because if you're tracking each buff that you could possibly put on there, and then in the previous edition that was, a necessary tactic by the time you got to, 10th, 15th, 20th level was let's spend 5 minutes making sure all of our buffs are on. And I'm sure people had like that experience in 3.5 or 4th where it was like, we have this standard array of buffs that we say, all right, we cast all of our buffs and then make it all happen to kind of hand wave it a bit. But, 5th, I've never had that experience.
Well, and the big reason for that is in the D&D Next playtest, one of the bits of feedback we got over and over again is people wanted the game to play quickly.
Yeah.
They wanted combat to feel speedy, to still be interesting and have a lot of potentially deep tactical options, but to still move forward at a nice pace. And so we made sure, and the concentration rule is one way we did this, to really gain kind of control of things that previously in the game had caused the game to really slow down. And so one of those was having a bunch of concurrent magical effects. We also tell DMs, watch out about going against the rule about attuning to more than 3 magic items.
Right. Now, where did that come from?
So in previous editions, occasionally magic items have been controlled through what were called slots, almost like imagining, kind of like in a video game where you
have your 8 slots.
And you put items in.
And ion stones were good because they didn't take up a slot.
And what we decided is we wanted to simplify that, particularly because sometimes you could actually, the slots really abstracted and said, okay, you can have only one cloak, even though we know a person could actually layer 2 cloaks in the real world.
I layer all the time. It's very important.
Yes, especially in Seattle.
And if you take a cloak off and wrap it around your waist, does that count? Are you still getting the magical benefits of that?
So actually, we wanted to provide the kind of flexibility where that sort of creative play would be possible. And so we really just simplified it down to you can attune to 3 magic items, whatever they are. Like that could mean you could wear 3 rings. And we went with 3, partly because it was a nice controlled number. And as we designed the magic items, we're like, we can live with up to 3 of these sort of ongoing effects being in place at a time.
Yeah.
But also 3 is just nice because in fantasy and myth, often
the trilogy.
And often the sort of like magic things often come in 3s.
Yeah.
So
3 rings for the Elven Kings.
Yes. Yeah. And so we, so there's also a little bit of a mythic quality to it. And I love talking about that aspect of our design because I often will get asked, is this or that rule or this or that piece of design, is it all about the balance? Is it all about us worrying about something breaking? Balance is really important to us. But we also make a lot of design decisions that are really about fantasy resonance. And we often won't explain them fully, partly because we want to inspire. We want there to kind of be a creative space for a DM to come in and interpret what these things mean.
Yeah.
But a lot of the things we do are based on what's resonant from folklore, fantasy, some of the pop culture that influenced D&D in the past.
Yeah, I never heard the reason why 3 was the number of magic items chosen, and that immediately went to all of those things in my head.
And because the rule of 3 it's particularly a big deal in the Planescape product line, where point out that there are many things in the D&D multiverse that come in 3s.
Yeah,
and and you even see that in very classic fairy tale fashion with our hag covens. That it's 3 hags. Of course, it could be more, but
that Macbeth. I mean, it's always going to be 3 witches in my mind.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, and so the game is actually filled with things like that. That if you look under each rock of the game or behind each tapestry, it's like there's rules there. And yes, we have spreadsheets where we were, working out the balance, but also part of it at the end of the day is we want it to feel like this game exists in a world of fairy tales and high heroic fantasy adventure.
Yeah. It feels mythic. I think that you said that word earlier, and I hadn't really, kind of latched onto that as talking about 5th edition rules, but it does kind of feel that way in a way that anybody can look at this and be like, oh, this is part of the fantasy that is now woven throughout all of our culture.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So you wanted to also talk about, sorry to segue here, but into the idea of rules and how the specific rules are governed by the general rules.
Yes. Yeah. In the introduction to the Player's Handbook, we offer you a few rules that you need to keep in mind.
Let me stop you there, just because I think we have a technical problem. We need to change a battery on our camera real quick. So you guys in chat, we're going to take like a 2-minute break and change out a battery. If you have any questions for Jeremy, go ahead and throw a question in large caps in the chat, and maybe we'll get to those at the end of the session, but we'll be back in like just 2 minutes to deal with this. Sound like a plan? Yay. All right, we're back. Sorry about that. Everything's fixed. Sean has got everything ready to go. So cool. All right. So yeah, Jeremy, you wanted to talk specifically about how the specific rules in Dungeons and Dragons take precedence over the general rules, and even just what the idea of what general and specific means.
Yes.
For some folks, so you get a lot of questions on this.
Yeah, and so the Player's Handbook gives you just a couple of things you need to know up front before you dive into the rules of the game. Mm-hmm. One of them is whenever the game gives you a fraction, round down. It's kind of a funny thing to be forefronted, but there are many things in the game that have you dividing or multiplying, what have you, always round down.
I love that rule because it means math is like just out the door. You don't need to really think about fractions as much as you had in previous editions at all. You can just be like, all right, doesn't matter, down to the nearest integer.
But it is funny that even though that rule is right there at the beginning, I get asked this a lot. Like in our recent Unearthed Arcana series, there were sometimes class features where it would say, add a number equal to half your warlock level or something like that. And people were like, do I round up or round down? And again, the rule is you round down.
Right. Is there ever an exception to that?
Yes, sometimes there are exceptions. And so that now goes to the other universal rule, which is the specific, if it disagrees with the general rule, wins. So what that means is if anywhere in the game there's a rule that, for instance, says the sky in all D&D worlds is purple, but then you read a text somewhere about a particular world and it says, in this world it's not purple, it's blue. Well, that is more specific than that other rule, and so that one wins for that context.
Got it.
And so what that means is even though there's the general rule that says round down, you might, though, come across a place that says round up. And so if a particular class feature or monster ability or what have you in the game says round up, well, in that case, you ignore the general rule and you pay attention now to the specific rule, which we often refer to as an exception.
Right.
Where, again, the exceptional beats the general.
And in game design terms in general, that is an exception-based design type idea where there is the design about how combat works in Dungeons and Dragons, but then most of the class features are exceptions to how those rules work. And that's where the power of a specific class or ability or spell comes from, is by breaking the rules that you set forth in the general.
Absolutely. Really, you put your finger on it. Really, almost every class feature, feat, monster ability could be thought of as a way in which that thing is somehow breaking the general rules.
Right.
And that's what makes it exciting. That's what makes it powerful. Now, to really get into this approach to game design, this what's called an exceptions-based design, you first need to understand what the general rules are.
Right.
And the most important general rules of the game, most of them are in Part 2 of the Player's Handbook, which is called, handily enough, actually I should have had it open. This is why I always have my books.
It's called Adventuring, or?
No. That's actually one of the chapters in that part.
Oh, I see.
The
Part 1, Part 2.
Yes, the Player's Handbook is divided into 3 parts. Part 2 is called Playing the Game. And most of the game's general rules are in this part. So this part is divided into a chapter on using your ability scores, a chapter on adventuring, that's the one you're thinking of, the chapter on combat. And then in the next part of the book, which is all about magic, we then also have the rules all about spellcasting. Mm-hmm. If a person reads those 4 chapters, they're going to know most of the general rules that govern the entire game. Mm-hmm. There are a few other things that are also good to read. Like if you're going to use magic items, you should read the Magic Item Introduction and the Dungeon Master's Guide, because that provides the general rules for all magic items. And then if you're a DM and you're using monsters, you're going to want to read the introduction of the Monster Manual, because that provides all the general rules for using a monster stat block and how to interpret it. Once you know what the general rules are, and there's actually another bit that's important to read because it comes up so often, and that is the appendix in the Player's Handbook, all about conditions.
Right.
Because so many rules in the game, whether it's a class feature, a spell, a monster ability, a magic item, rely on an understanding of what the different conditions do. Conditions like, prone, unconscious, restrained, blinded.
Yeah, all that. And what those definitions are, because so often, same with exceptions, the class abilities will either bestow those conditions on things, so it's very important to understand those, but also be like, oh, you can do this while blinded, or you can do this while stunned when you wouldn't normally be able to.
Right. Also, for any listener who's not aware of it, most of these general rules are also available for free in our basic rules PDF on the D&D website.
Oh, that's a good point too, right?
And also, most of these core rules appear in the little rules booklet in the starter set. So there are several different ways to get your hands on these rules that form the kind of the engine for everything else.
I love how compact those are. I mean, you're talking about I was going to say, the player's handbook is where all the general rules are, but you're really just talking about that one part, and it's like 30 pages, 40 pages?
Yeah, actually, most of the player's handbook is exceptional stuff.
Yes, exactly.
Spells, class features, and whatnot. And that was intentional. I worked very hard when crafting the final form of the 5th edition rules to try to get them to be as concise as possible so that they could fit, for the most part, in the starter set. They could go in a free product like the basic rules online.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to make it so people could wrap their heads around these basics, because they're then going to be bombarded with exception after exception after exception.
Right.
And one of the really important things once you're dealing with those exceptions is A, remember that they always override a general rule if they disagree, and B, an exception, whatever it says, only applies to itself. I bring this up.
Oh, okay.
I bring this up because often a person might read a spell. They'll read a spell like Burning Hands that says it sets any unattended flammable object in its area on fire.
Right.
Then a person might come across another fire spell that doesn't say that. And they'll think, that other fire spell says it does this thing. I bet this other fire spell is meant to do that too. That isn't how an exceptions-based game works. Once you're into an exception, whether it's a class feature, a spell, any other sort of small discrete game object in the game, whatever it says inside it applies only to itself. Now, that's true for a number of reasons. A, it means that when we're designing and developing the game, basically everything sort of stays in its lane. They're not crashing into each other. It helps us craft each thing so that it does exactly what it needs to do for itself, without a bunch of undesirable interactions with other things.
Because the danger of that is that if the example that you gave is true, then you have to think about every spell that involves flame,
right,
whether it's green or purple or whatever. All of a sudden, the extrapolation from that makes it very difficult to design a game because everything interacts with each other. And so if you're curtailing it back to, okay, no, this rule is only about this rule and this rule alone, it's much easier to actually have a vibrant game, right? Because then
and that actually relates to one of the other big reasons why we make sure an exception applies only to itself, because we want the game not to be a total chore for DMs and players. Because really what that means is we want the play experience to be like, let's say you cast the spell Thunderwave. All you have to do is, as long as you understand the general rules of spellcasting, is you just read what Thunderwave does, and that's what Thunderwave does.
Right.
You don't have to worry about what 5 other spells do to try to interpret how Thunderwave works. Thunderwave just does what it does.
Right. And there's definitely some times where you repeat things in the spell descriptions, and I like that too, because it doesn't feel like you need to have this encyclopedic knowledge of all spells in order for you to be a spellcaster.
Right.
You just need to really know how you do that one thing,
yeah,
and it's all right there.
Just like if you're reading a class feature of a particular subclass, like let's say you're looking at the Way of Shadow and the Monk. Its class features and how they work have no bearing whatsoever on how any other subclass's features work. They only pertain to how they work.
Right.
But everything in the game does assume a familiarity with the general rules. Here's a great example. In the combat chapter of the Player's Handbook, and again, also in the free basic rules and in the starter set, we tell you one of the important basic rules of the game, which is if you're making a melee weapon attack, no matter with what weapon, if any kind of melee weapon attack, you use your strength for that. If you make a ranged weapon attack, you use dexterity. That is true in the entire game, unless something specifically tells you otherwise.
Yeah.
I bring this up because also in the recent Unearthed Arcana series, some of the new subclasses might have some like special weapon they create or what have you, and we would say in a feature, all right, you make a melee weapon attack with this thing. And the question that I would often get is, well, do I use strength with this? And the answer is always yes, because the general rule said so. And a general rule is only shut off in a particular instance if an exception specifically contradicts the general rule.
Right. So if you wanted to use a different ability score or something like that, the specific rule would say, make a melee attack in this case using dexterity, or make a dexterity-based attack, or however you would word it. It would be much better than what I just came up with.
But that's pretty close.
Yeah.
Like for a great example of making an explicit exception is in the Unearthed Arcana series, the Hexblade had the ability to use charisma for certain melee weapon attacks instead of either strength or dexterity.
Right.
And that's spelled out in the class feature. There is also a piece of the game outside of class where people can use a score other than strength for a melee weapon attack, and that is when a person's using a weapon with the finesse property.
Right.
The finesse property is another example of an exception, where that property tells you you can use either strength or dexterity for this melee weapon attack when you use this finesse weapon. But again, that applies only in that exceptional case. Otherwise, the general rule holds that if you're making a melee weapon attack, you're doing so with strength.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's a good way to think about the whole framework about how we put together. I keep saying the word framework. That's like I've been watching Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. too much. I'm in the framework right now. But I don't know. I like talking to you about this because we can kind of get behind what is going on with the rules, and then when we introduce new stuff like the Unearthed Arcana series that you keep mentioning, it makes it even more interesting when we come from this common ground and things to go from. So thank you so much for going through all this. Is there anything else you want to hit on that specific philosophy before we get to some questions?
The one thing I would say is actually enough of these questions came up in the Unearthed Arcana series that as I'm finishing up work on our upcoming book, Xanathar's Guide to Everything,
yes,
I am trying to carve out just a little bit of space in the book to put in a top 10 rules reminders thing to take up, again, only like a page or two in the book early on, because there are some of these general rules I have found that get missed quite a bit. Sometimes it's because they're buried somewhere in one of our books. We could have done a better job of highlighting them or forefronting them. But whatever the reason, I realized sometimes it might be good for us to have a kind of a cheat sheet of
a checklist. These are the ones. If before you ask a question of sage advice, hit these. Make sure it doesn't already get covered.
Well, and also just make sure you remember these as you are about to dive into this host of new options.
Right. So that makes sense.
So that you're not thrown by some of the things that you're going to see.
Nice. Well, I'm excited about Xanathar's Guide to Everything coming out this November, and it's got a new alt cover that's made by Hydro 74, which looks really cool, so you can check that out in game stores. I think it's November 21st is the wide release, so that means November 10th is when you can pick it up in game stores. So
I was working on it right before I came into the studio.
Oh, nice. And we'll be hopefully checking in with you over the course of the summer and the fall as we do more of these online. Where can people find out where they can get questions sent to you on Twitter, or where do you want to send people?
The best place is on Twitter, at Jeremy E. Crawford.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Well, thanks, Jeremy, for joining me for this. And stick around for just a couple seconds, and we'll do some questions from the chat. But thank you very much.
My pleasure.
All right, sweet. And therein ends the podcast section of this recording. Thank you guys so much. I know I called for questions a long time ago, and there's a bunch up here that we can look at. So let's just start at the top. This is from Asta Farion. Sean, can you move the window over a little bit? I'm missing like the first. There you go. Pasta Farion. Oh, of course, that makes much more sense. So, as you know, we weren't able to come to the Stream of Annihilation because you unfortunately got sick, I think, right beforehand, right? You were going to be interviewed during our stream event a few weeks ago.
Yes, yeah. I was we were going to talk about Sage Advice, and I was going to be on there with Mike to announce Xanathar's Guide to Everything.
Exactly.
But I came down with strep throat, so I was at home so that I didn't get everyone in that studio.
We didn't want you
sick.
to be patient zero for that.
Yeah.
But you were there in spirit, of course, and so of course, what do you think about the rise of streaming shows like Critical Role or Dice Camera Action or all the ones that we've been doing? How does that affect what you do?
I think it is fantastic, and not only because it is helping more and more people see how fun and dynamic D&D can be, but I also love that it demonstrates just how diverse D&D play is. Because one thing I notice is that play online tends to be very free form, tends to have a focus on story. And early in the D&D Next playtest, Mike Merles and I often would talk about the fact that we wanted this edition of D&D to be a big tent and to have a place for the people who are really improvisers at heart and actors and storytellers, but also have a place for people who are more interested in tactics and gameplay and using miniatures. And so I love the contrast that you can go to something like Critical Role and you will see this dramatic story, well acted, while at the same time at a convention like Origins, which was just this past weekend, or at Gen Con or PAX, you'll see tables where people will have elaborate miniatures setups, and it's almost veering toward being like a tactical miniatures war game. And for me, it's all D&D.
Yeah.
And so I love that we're really demonstrating online that all of these different expressions are Dungeons and Dragons. They're all in that big tent. And I'm just happy about anything that makes it so that more people around the world can see what a fantastic game D&D is and what a great way to spend time with friends.
Neat. Cool. Thank you for that question, Pastafarian, by the way. And for this next bit, this is from Tito Bit. I'm going to say it's Tito Bit, even though it could be Tito Bit. Specific versus general. Is a class feature, we kind of already did, but is a class feature more or less specific than a spell description?
So a class feature and a spell, they are both specific. And so that touches on something we didn't delve into, and that is what happens when you have two exceptions that might
both contradict a general. Which one takes precedence?
Well, so we have tried to craft as much of the game as possible so that there will not be conflicts like that. If a conflict should arise between two exceptions, it's really up to the DM to adjudicate the interaction. And this is one reason why the DM is so important, because in a game with this many exceptions, and a game where players can be so creative, because also one of the other most basic rules of D&D is a player says what they want to do and the DM tells them how they do it.
Right.
And with the rule that open-ended, a lot can happen. And a lot of interactions can occur that we could never predict in our design and development. I mean, even if we developed the game for 10 years, I guarantee within a week of releasing the game, someone would find an interaction that hadn't occurred to us and thousands of playtesters.
Right, and you can't write a concise rules book that covers every single corner case of things that may happen in some imaginary future.
But yeah, so to go back to the question, a class feature and a spell, they're both specific. They're both exceptions. Now, a class feature can sometimes function as a general rule to something like a spell, because sometimes you'll have a class feature or a feat that's giving you the spell. Mm-hmm. And so that's another way also to sense the kind of hierarchy, but from general to specific as you kind of drill down. If one thing is giving you the other thing, that thing that gave it to you is more general than the thing
that
itself.
you're getting.
Yeah,
right.
than the thing that you're getting.
Okay.
And I say that because sometimes a feat that gives you a spell or a class feature that gave you a spell will then make an exception to the general spellcasting rules. It might say, like a feat might say, hey, you get to cast this spell, but you don't have to expend spell slots. Well, right there, it just made an exception to other spellcasting rules in the game.
I get a feeling that he's thinking about a more specific thing that might have happened. And if that's the case, feel free to keep answering that questions or ping Jeremy on Twitter.
Yeah.
Because I feel like it might be a case-by-case basis.
Absolutely.
Kind of thing.
And when it comes to exceptions, spells, monsters, their abilities, I always like to answer questions about very particular things. Because in an exceptions-based game, often what's true for one exception is not true for another. So that's why sometimes people on Twitter will ask me kind of really broad questions about various exceptions. And almost always I'll respond by saying, well, which particular thing are you curious about?
Yeah.
Because what I tell you about Fireball might have no relevance to how Lightning Bolt functions. Because they both follow the general spellcasting rules. But there might be some sentence in one of those spells that I or another member of the team put in there for a particular reason for that particular exception that, again, has no relevance to the other spell.
This was like when we were talking about the breathing of a monster if it has lungs, that conversation. And it was like, all right, well, that, to me, if just the fact that there was lungs in one description or breathing, those specific words in that spell description can be ruled on, So, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. Thank you for that question. I don't know if we answered it, but it's getting to the heart of what this design philosophy is all about. Okay, so this is an easy one for you, Jeremy B. This is not you. You do not answer this question. When will you release?
I'd love to send myself questions.
I know, right? And he can answer them all in a second. When is a new Sage Advice column coming to the D&D website?
Oh, so we are hoping it will come back, if not in July, then in August. Really, it's as simple as I have been so busy with getting Tomb of Annihilation finished and then wrapping up Xanathar's Guide to Everything, that getting the written column done and in the mix of all of that and summer conventions has been a challenge.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why we started doing more Sage Advice segments on the podcast as well as these, is that we're hopefully filling that niche of people asking questions and having that back and forth with you and the fans by doing this more directly too. Yeah. So there's that. And maybe what we should do is get a fan or somebody to do transcriptions of all of these conversations and we're like, that's the column. It's done.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So this question is from Fuzzbox. And I think actually I might say this is coming very soon. Is there any chance we'll see the mechanics of crafting explored in more depth? Things such as what you can really do with tinker tools and herbalism kits versus alchemy kits.
Yeah. So actually crafting is something we explored in the Unearthed Arcana series recently in the expanded downtime rules that we released. Those were received very well. And so people can expect to see those rules appearing in some form in the game.
And is that coming for Xanathar's Guide, or is that going to be coming later?
It is, in fact, going to be in Xanathar's Guide to Everything.
Okay, cool. Unless we need to cut like 20 pages, which happens when you talk to all of our stuff about a Tales from the Yawning Portal when we're putting stuff together. Sometimes you always say text is the thing that you will take out if the layout needs to look good. So
and I have to say, even some of the initial announcements about Xanathar's, while I was at home sick, looking at what was on our website or what was said, I thought, well, everything mentioned is almost 100% likely going to be in the book.
We might cut it. It's hard to say.
Right, because I sometimes will have to make last-minute decisions about what's going to be in the book because of fitting everything in. Or we are still getting some playtest feedback coming in from our NDA'd playtesters. And we study that very carefully. And if something just is not clicking, like if we've done revision after revision after revision, and the player response is basically, no thanks, thanks for trying.
Yeah.
At that point, often I have to make the decision to remove the patient from life support,
or at least get back to the drawing board and not have to feel like you're under the gun to get something out just for the sake of getting it out. Right. I think that is a philosophy that's changed a lot in 5th edition as well as because there's been a relatively smaller number of products, RPG books that we're producing. They are of the highest quality, and only the stuff that actually gets play tested and is up to your estimations, really, as you're the final arbiter in some ways as to whether or not it's good enough to be in a published product. I don't think that was the case previously.
Well, part of it is we are now we have a level of engagement with the community that really helps guide the game development that I oversee. Mm-hmm. Mike Merles and I have talked before, particularly recently, about the fact that we have actually a pretty hard metric we look for. We want to see, if we're going to put something into the game officially, we want to see it to be satisfying, if not more than satisfying, to at least 70% of the audience.
Whoa, 70%? That's like,
we are strict.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have a few things slated for Xanathar's Guide to Everything that are on the line, and every time I look at them, I'm like,
you're like 69%. Usually I'd say nice, but not this time.
So, and again, that's why we iterate, we revise, we send it back to playtesters, and hope that the satisfaction rating goes up. And we've had some great results, especially with the recent Unearthed Arcana series, where we had some things that initially came in like in the 60s. And usually if something comes in initially in the 60s in terms of satisfaction,
mm-hmm. you can bump it up through a couple iterations.
We consider that to be a development opportunity. Yeah. We don't can something if it on our first try, if it comes in below if it's not in the, if it's below 70%.
I love how data-driven this is all, too. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know if the tools even existed 20, 30 years ago for people to be like getting that real-time level of like, 70% of playtesters like this. It just didn't exist.
Yeah. And it also means we have often a very clear idea of what it is D&D players as a whole want. Mm-hmm. And so that also helps us from kind of wandering off into the woods and kind of like creating like, look at this beautiful castle we built that we then discover only 10% of our audience wanted.
Right. And that's funny because we were just talking with Stan Brown in the interview segment about TSR and how there was these black clouds of curtains between what was actually how things were received versus how they were designing things. And so those curtains are lifted away in the current iteration of 5th edition, and that you guys probably have more direct access to players' opinions than people ever had.
Yeah, and it's invaluable. I mean, I often like to say that not only does D&D belong to everybody who plays it and loves it, but this edition in particular really belongs to the entire community, because the entire community is contributing to the edition's life, to its development. The voice of the community is fundamental to how we develop it, fundamental to the decisions I make in every book when I decide, is this gonna make it into print or not?
Right.
Always I'm looking to the community, is this really what my fellow D&D players really desire for this game?
So I think we have time for one final question, and we kind of already hinted at this, but maybe this is a combining of two of our questions into one kind of thing. And this question is from Elwarius. Has the rising of D&D as entertainment in shows and streams affected the direction on subsequent rules and mechanics? And then, he's basically saying how many DMs kind of hack the game. So do you guys pay attention to that? Do you design towards being more entertaining on streams, or is it really just more about how people are playing the game?
So we do not design the game specifically for streaming. I mean, in many ways, this has been a kind of wonderful organic development that in some ways I think there's so much 5th edition being streamed because it's very stream friendly.
Yeah.
Because the game doesn't require the use of miniatures, it means people can do theater of the mind style play. pardon me, it's pretty easy for a person to improvise, particularly because, as we were discussing earlier, the core rules are pretty straightforward. I mean, just, again, knowing tell me, I'm the DM, tell me what you want to do, Greg, and I'll tell you how you do it. And then I have the simple rule of I can give you advantage or disadvantage. Just with those basic tools, you can do a whole lot.
Yeah. And in some ways, I mean, that phrase, which you're paraphrasing there, of like, what do you want to do, has become a catchphrase for Matt Mercer and Critical Role.
Yeah.
How do you want to do this?
Mm-hmm.
And that's, in some ways, goes back to what 5th edition was trying to get across in the way. So, I mean, maybe to answer the question a little bit, is like it was a happy accident that it made streaming so much more better, and it's become like a chicken and egg type thing.
Yeah, and a great example of how actually simple the game is at its heart is I believe it was at PAX I think it was at Emerald City Comic Con.
Mm-hmm.
I was DMing a game, and I had 2 people at the convention who'd never played D&D before at my table, and I love having brand new players. And I also play a ton of board games. I don't talk about it as much on Twitter as maybe I could, but I'm actually a huge board game nerd.
As well as video games.
Yes,
too.
I also play a lot of video games, partly because I feel like I need to play a lot of other games to constantly be inspired, to see what's going on currently.
Yeah.
But also I'm just a huge gamer. And often in my board game group, because I have a group of friends and we play board games together about once a week. Sometimes we get too busy and it's a couple times a month.
Sure.
But almost always it's my job to explain the rules. And I've had board games before where we've been talking about the rules for like 45 minutes before we can even start playing the game. I often love those games, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
And it was really gratifying to me when I was DMing at the convention with these brand new players. I was able to explain everything they needed to know to get started playing D&D in about 10 minutes.
Wow.
Because the DM runs the game, and in this case, I was the DM, I could just explain to them as we went along how things worked. And the main thing I told them is just explain to me what it is you want to do, what you imagine your character doing, and I'll tell you how you now interact with the rules to accomplish those things.
Yeah.
Because
you can cover a lot of ground that way.
Absolutely.
So it really just becomes, exercising your imagination. And I had that same experience when we were prepping for the Stream of Annihilation. Some of the members of the production team, so the cameramen and the directors and all those, they knew what Dungeons & Dragons was, but they hadn't played before, and they wanted to know. And I was like, all right, great, well, let's do it. And so I had a few people who had never played before, and it was as simple as that. I took about maybe 10, 15 minutes explaining what their character sheet was and the important numbers on that, and then everything else was just through play.
Mm-hmm.
And people immediately leaped at oh, can I do this? And I'm like, yes, you can. And this is exactly how you do it. And it took the one kind of more braver person to do that once, and then they learned from each other too, which I thought was really kind of interesting.
Yeah. And I always love it when I see in a group of players, whether they're new or sometimes even D&D veterans, the light that suddenly glimmers in their eyes when they remember I can try anything. They're not necessarily going to succeed. They might fail spectacularly, but they can try anything.
And it may not even be the right thing to do in the moment. I think someone actually shot the main NPC with an arrow, and I was like, yeah, you can do that if you want. I don't want you to, and I don't think anybody else at the table wants you to, but you do it, and he's dead now. So great, And so it's fun to realize that the actions have consequences too, and I think that's a little bit different than a lot of board games or other things like that. It's like, yes, you can do anything. It may not be the right thing, but or not right thing, but it's the thing that's necessary to tell the story and move the story forward.
And the thing is even veteran D&D players can get into this. I love that in my home D&D campaign, Chris Perkins in particular, he plays this halfling arcane trickster. Chris will almost never tell me what his character does in rules terms. Chris, it's funny, Chris actually plays my game almost like he's a brand new D&D player. He will just tell me, all right, this is what Norrell does, and then I explain, okay, roll this, here's how you do that. And Chris, of course, knows how his character works. He has all his class features and everything in front of him.
Yeah.
but it's
He
really
doesn't speak in those languages. He speaks in the language
it's always
of the
about
story.
the story, and then we weave the story together, and
That's super cool.
And so I love seeing again that even that improvisation, that play, we're going to make a story together. That can even still be alive and exciting among some of us sort of D&D grognards.
We've been doing it forever,
yeah,
for sure. We've made the rules exactly how they are.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody who stuck around in chat. It was a lot of fun. Thank you for all those questions. Those are really good. I think we might do this again soon. Are you free next Monday? I forgot to ask you because I think Chris and Matt I think Matt is out. So I think a sage advice, if you are free. Well, I'm not going to put you on the spot on the stream to answer that question.
Right.
But we'll be doing more of these as the summer goes on. So thank you guys so much for watching. Again, tomorrow we have D&D News, which I'll do some of these announcements and things before Chris Perkins comes back for Dice Camera Action. It's very dramatic what is happening in that storyline. I believe Evelyn now actually will perish. We'll see how that goes and what the consequences of that are as they get into the Tomb of Annihilation story that's happening to the Waffle Crew. On Wednesday, I don't think we have anything particularly planned this week, but on Thursday, we're having a new episode of Girls Guts Glory, episode 2 of The Death Curse. If you haven't seen the first episode of their new storyline, go in and check it out. It's on YouTube and on this very Twitch page. And then on the subsequent weeks, we'll be doing a lot more other streaming shows starting on Tuesday and Wednesday night. We got Maze Arcana at 7 p.m. on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. That's DM'd by Satine Phoenix and Rudy Rutenberg down in L.A. The High Rollers show is starting in the last week in June, I believe on Fridays, and as well the Dragon Friends from Australia will be streaming and/or broadcasting their games starting around that same time frame as well. So look forward to that. Go check our D&D Twitch page for all the scheduling. And of course, if you have any questions about this or anything else, you can talk to me at Greg Tito on Twitter, and Wizards_D&D is the official Twitter page. And you can get all of the announcements and things that are coming down the pipe there. Xanathar's Guide to Everything, which is still being worked on right now, again, is November 1st. It's wide. And November 10th in game stores with a special alt cover, and Tomb of Annihilation comes out September 8th in game stores, and I believe September 19th worldwide. So check that out then. I'm done talking. I think I need more coffee because I'm done. Thanks, you guys, and we'll be back next week with more Dragon Talk starting at 2 p.m. on Mondays.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.